towards human security and peace by addressing the root causes of the conflict. Bringing the occupation of Palestinian territory to a close is essential to ending the suffering and enabling aid workers to deliver critical relief in hope of recovery to those in need. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al señor.
I thank Mr. Epstein for his briefing. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Thank you, Mr. President. The killing of Palestinian civilians is not a collateral effect of the war. This Israeli assault relies by design on mass and indiscriminate killing of civilians. The humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is not the consequence of a war. It is a tool employed by Israel to pressure people and force them out. The famine underway is not an undesired outcome of the war. It is starvation as a method of war. The collapse of the health system is not an unforeseen result of a war. It is the result of premeditated attacks against hospitals and medical personnel. The indiscriminate killing, the mass arrest, filmed humiliation of Palestinians, enforced disappearance and abduction, and summary executions aim at terrorizing the Palestinian people as a whole. This is an assault by atrocities, a full-fledged assault on 2.3 million Palestinians, besieged, bombarded, displaced, starved. For over 80 days now, 2.3 million Palestinians have been fighting for their life. From dawn till dusk, from dusk till dawn. Every single day for 80 days. There is undeniable evidence, multiple confessions of the criminal nature of this assault and of its criminal objectives, the destruction of a people to force their displacement. This is why peoples around the world, states across the globe, moral voices are expressing outrage and calling for an end to the massacres. Mr. President, what do you say on behalf of a people enduring a genocide? On behalf of a people blamed for their own deaths by those killing them, blamed for the oppression they are subjected to by those occupying them. On behalf of a people facing an existential threat, while those responsible for this threat insist it is their survival that is at stake. The killers demand apologies from those criticizing them for their crimes. They demand political, financial, and military support from the allies they humiliate and dismiss. They demand from their victims to be grateful that they have not imposed on them even more death and destruction, and demand from the world, witness of their crimes, to recognize they are the most moral army in the world. Israel considers that the problem are those denouncing the crimes, not those committing them. It openly attempts to bully them, intimidate them, silence them. To try and justify the unjustifiable, Israel invokes a history that condemns them, principles that they breach. They invoke the Holocaust to justify the mass killing of innocent civilians, a shameful use and abuse of the memory of 6 million innocent victims. We honor the memory of the victims of the Holocaust and all victims by upholding international law, not justifying its breach, by saving innocent lives, not justifying indiscriminate killing, by refusing to have different sets of laws applying based on the identity of the perpetrators and the identity of the victims, not by promoting supremacy and discrimination. Mr. President, this Council has called for protection of civilians, for immediate, safe, unhindered, and expanded humanitarian access, for the delivery of humanitarian assistance throughout the Gaza Strip, for respect for the laws of war, and it has rejected forced displacement, all of which require an immediate ceasefire that this Council has been prevented to call for repeatedly. Israel has reacted with disregard and disdain. Why are they getting away with murder at this unprecedented scale? Because they were never held accountable. That is why they confess to their crimes. That is why they steal our lives, our land, our resources, our money, our past, our present, and our future in broad daylight. Mr. President, one day the massacres will stop. But how will we get over it? How will we get over the mass graves, the inability to bury our loved ones, to offer them a dignified burial, seeing them in plastic bags? How will we get over 1,000 Palestinian children amputated without anesthesia? Can you hear their screams? Can you feel their pain? Can you imagine if they were your own children? How can we get over 8,000 Palestinians under the rubble? Those who were blessed to die quickly, and those who endured a terrible and terrifying death, a slow death under the rubble while we were unable to save them. How do you get over a genocide? We will be asked, nevertheless, despite all that we are enduring and all that we have endured for 75 years, to move on, to count our dead one more time, to count our wounded, our permanently disabled, the people scarred for life, the millions of victims, and move on. We will be asked to be peaceful. We will be asked to be grateful that this horrible chapter among so many other chapters, even though this one is the worst one we have gone through, is over until the next one begins. This is the ultimate expression of double standards. The other side is never asked to move on if Israelis are killed, never asked to be peaceful in such situations. This is the ultimate expression of racism, of dehumanization of our nation. We shall all be subject to the same rules, to the same expectations. We should all have our humanity recognized and respected. Those who have dared till now to find a way or another to justify what is happening in the Gaza Strip will have to endure shame forever. For those calling on our people not to seek vengeance, not to resort to violence, they must support our efforts to deliver justice. That is the path we have chosen, justice, not vengeance. But till now, that path has been obstructed in the face of the Palestinian people, and no one has ever been held accountable for the crimes committed against them. Israeli impunity cannot be allowed to survive this assault. So finally, Palestinian survivors can live with the sense that the massacres will not resume. The horrors this impunity has led to will continue occurring until this is brought to an end. Mr. President, the world is discovering the true Gaza while Israel is destroying it. They discover as Israel destroys our university and schools that we have one of the highest literacy rates in the world. They discover as Israel destroys our historic mosques and churches that we have religious diversity and a Christian community in Gaza that is an integral part of our history, our present, and our future. The world discovers the name of brave Palestinian journalists and doctors as they learn they were killed. They discover about a young Palestinian generation that was able to be creative and to perform and to try to lead a life in impossible circumstances, only to face death once again. The world discovers human beings who, despite repeated assaults and a decade and a half of blockade, somehow preserved hope, cultivated it, built their homes to see them destroyed, built them once more, saw them destroyed once more, built them again, built their lives despite loss and suffering. From within the ruins, they were able to rise again, only to face death once again. They found a way back to life, only to see death and destruction haunting them once more. Until when? That is what Israel is attacking. Hope. That is its greatest enemy. The fact the Palestinian people have not relinquished hope. the ability of our people to resurrect. They want to make sure that Palestinians in Gaza have no homes to return to. They want to make sure they have no life to return to. They want to make sure that life in Gaza is no longer possible, with one aim, what they call voluntary migration. Voluntary. 21,000 people killed, half of them almost children. And by the way, we mentioned the children and the women. Many innocent men have been killed. Voluntary migration, the code name for forced displacement. These are the options for Palestinians: destruction or displacement, death or displacement. Mr. President, in Bethlehem, Jesus' birthplace, celebrations were canceled. But in reality, the message delivered and embodied by Jesus was celebrated by standing up and speaking out for the Palestinian people in Gaza, for the oppressed, as he would have done, those who suffer, as he would have done, those who endure, as he would have done. Bethlehem itself endures its share of pain and suffering, mutilated by a wall, and like all cities and villages of the West Bank, victim of constant attacks by settlers and occupation forces. The reality that the Christians of Palestine are enduring is unbearable. It is the same that all Palestinians are enduring, including in the Armenian Quarter, in occupied East Jerusalem, where they are fighting for their identity and their existence. Mr. President, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, at the occasion of the report released yesterday on the West Bank, stressed that, and I quote, "The violations documented in this report repeat the pattern and nature of violations reported in the past in the context of the long-standing Israeli occupation of the West Bank. However, the intensity and the violence and the repression is something that has not been seen in years." End quote. These 3 months have been the deadliest in the West Bank, the deadliest the West Bank had witnessed in decades, including for children. But don't worry, Israel will attack the UN for reporting on its crimes instead of putting an end to them. There is a war underway against the Palestinian people as a whole, against our existence in our homeland, against our identity, our history, and our future. Mr. President, Netanyahu expressed a few days ago his pride to have prevented the independence of the Palestinian state, to have undermined and destroyed the peace accords. He is bragging that he is destroying peace in our region. He is bragging openly that he has been obstructing the chance of peace. And by doing that, he has been undermining the security of both the Palestinian people and the Israeli people. His intentions have always been clear to anybody willing to look. He has been one of the main protagonists of the war for Palestinian geography and against Palestinian demography in the last 3 decades. Netanyahu's political platform is denying Palestinian existence and rights. His political survival requires a never-ending and ever-spreading war. Netanyahu continues rewriting history 75 years after the Nakba, saying that Palestine was a wasteland when over 1 million Palestinians lived in cities and had a cultural life and a political life and life, just life in that land, to justify prolonging the Nakba and attempting to finish the job. We have been down the path of negating existence, killing and destroying so many times before. We have been down that path for 75 years. Anybody thinks it's a good idea to continue down that path? Israel announced several times it had handled the Palestinian question. Netanyahu himself told the world a few weeks ago, here in the UN, there was nothing to worry about, raising a map that had disappeared Palestine altogether. Does anyone believe the matter was handled? Does anyone believe that more killing, destruction, and denial of rights will put an end to the matter? Recognition of our existence and of our rights and their respect is the only way towards shared peace and security. That is our goal, shared peace and security. Mr. President, how much injustice can a nation take? How much killing? How much humiliation? How much pain? Our suffering is not inevitable. It is man-made, occupation-made. The powerlessness of some world powers is not inevitable. It is self-inflicted. There is an international consensus. There is international law. They were not elaborated against anyone, but for the benefit of all. They need to be implemented. We remain committed to them. But they need to protect our people. We cannot only have obligations and be denied our rights, and the other side claims all rights for themselves and no obligations. That's not how international law works. It needs to be implemented, as we are witnessing before our very eyes what their breach leads to. Mr. President, as we approach the new year, 75 years have come and gone, and there is a nation still deprived of its land and of its most fundamental rights, still occupied, oppressed, and killed. Our people have outlasted the massacres before. They will outlast them once again. But those killed will not be brought back to life. Those scarred will never truly heal. The impact of the Israeli massacres in Gaza will be felt for decades. Of course, for the Palestinian people who bear the wounds on their flesh, but also in our region and across the world. And if hope is not restored and freedom does not prevail, no one can predict the next chapter of this tragedy. But everyone knows it will be worse. As the world welcomes a new year, the massacres in Palestine continue, the injustice continues, the suffering continues. How many Palestinian generations will have to suffer before finally being able to live in freedom and dignity and peace in our ancestral land? We want to stop seeing our Nakba grow and finally be able to see our children grow. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al observador permanente del Estado.
I thank the representative of the Observer State of Palestine. I give the floor to Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I'm honestly shocked to be sitting here today. I'm shocked by the focus of this briefing. I'm shocked by the blatant lies being spread. I'm shocked at the utter dissonance from the reality on the ground. But most of all, I am shocked by this Council's willingness to waste its time focusing on such a marginal extremist phenomenon, while the entire region is on fire. And the true reason for this raging fire receives complete silence here. Council members, just yesterday morning, rockets were fired from Lebanon at population centers in Haifa and Akko in northern Israel. 2 days ago, rockets were fired at the northern Israeli city of Kiryat Shmona. And 3 days ago, Hezbollah fired guided anti-tank missiles at St. Mary's Church in the Western Galilee, injuring 11 people. Yet, these brazen attacks on civilians, towns, cities, and holy sites do not warrant an urgent briefing here in this Council. Do these attacks sound like a mere spillover? Is this violence occurring magically on its own? Is it not clear that genocidal terrorists are seeking to murder Israeli citizens every single day? Every single day. This Council is quick to show solidarity with civilians across the Middle East, so long as they are not Israelis. In fact, hardly a week goes by without some meeting regarding the protection of civilians in Gaza, and not a week passes without the UN and its officials calling to shield Lebanon and Syria. So why, when it comes to innocent Israeli civilians being targeted in northern Israel every day by Hezbollah, Hamas, and other Palestinian organizations, is this Council silent? Why have you not condemned the rocket fire from Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen? The situation in northern Israel is reaching a point of no return. Every day, innocent Israelis are under attack. If these attacks persist, Israel will ensure these acts of terror stop. So why have you not spoken up? Why have you not demanded that Lebanon take action to prevent terror attacks being carried out from their territory? Why is it that the UN remains silent in the face of terror only when it is directed against Israel? 50,000 Israeli civilians were displaced along the northern border because of the Iranian-backed attacks by Hezbollah from Lebanon. These attacks are a flagrant violation of Israel's sovereignty, of international law, and of Security Council resolutions, in particular 1701. If these attacks continue, I reiterate, the situation will escalate and may lead to a full-scale war. Lebanon must be held accountable for the aggression carried out from its territory. And let me be clear again, Israel will defend itself. I have warned this Council countless times, sent letters, but instead of discussing this clear and present threat to security of the Middle East, we are here again discussing a marginal issue which is a result of the conflict, but not its root cause. Council members, Israel is currently fighting a war for its very future against genocidal Hamas terrorists who committed the most widespread massacre of Israelis. 84 days after 1,300 Israelis were butchered, and while 129 are still being held hostage in Hamas terror tunnels, this Council still has not even condemned the Hamas Nazis' attack. Does this Council truly believe that the disgraceful act of a handful of extremists, Israeli extremists, are the true roadblock to a solution? Is this the topic that the Council should be focused on today? Acts of violence, mostly damage to property, which Israel's police force is cracking down upon to the full extent of the law? Rockets are raining down on Israel's north and south. Entire families have been burned alive by Hamas ISIS. But extremist violence is the hurdle to peace? There were no Israelis in the West Bank in 1948. There were no Israelis in the West Bank in 1967. Yet, the Palestinians and Arab countries still sought to annihilate Israel. Do you not see the absurdity? When will you address the true obstacles for peace in our region? Colleagues, last week there were 4 instances of extremist violence against Palestinians in Judea and Samaria. 4. And if you look at the numbers over the past 3 months, it is clear that extremist violence is de-escalating, contrary to the focus of this briefing. Israel condemns every act of violence. Israeli leadership, contrary to what was said here today, has made this clear. We condemned it. And not only are such crimes condemned by Israel, severe action is also being taken to combat it. Arrests have been made, indictments have been issued, and we make every effort to bring all perpetrators to justice. But still, this is a marginal issue, and it is in decline. So why has the Council dedicated an urgent briefing to this topic in the midst of a war? But if you want to discuss Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank as you call it, despite a war raging in the south and another war brewing in the north, let's talk about the widespread phenomenon that is truly threatening the situation in Judea and Samaria: Palestinian terror. Let's talk numbers. Since October 7th, there have been 1,028 shooting, stabbings, and IED attacks by Palestinian terrorists against Israelis. 1,028. In the same period, there have been 2,118 rock-throwing attacks and Molotov cocktails firebombings by Palestinian terrorists on Israelis. This is the reality. In less than 3 months, there were over 3,000 Palestinian terror attacks. Over 3,000. Over 15 times more than the incidents of extremist Israeli violence in the same time frame. Throughout 2023, nearly 8,000 Palestinian terror attacks were carried out against Israelis in Judea and Samaria. Yet, according to OCHA reports, these attacks are virtually non-existent. This Council is being lied to. because for the UN and its agencies, the truth is subjective. This is not only the case regarding Palestinian terror in Judea and Samaria. This is also the case in Gaza and wherever there is Palestinian terror carried out against Israelis. The UN either distorts or ignores the facts regarding Israeli terror victims. The UN is one of the main driving forces for the sick phenomena we are seeing now. From October 7th, atrocity denial to the denial of rape and sexual violence perpetrated by Hamas. The UN is an accomplice of terror organizations and anti-Semites. Because for the UN, Israeli lives don't matter. Israeli lives don't matter. Why is it that the casualty numbers supplied by the Hamas Ministry of Health are immediately taken at face value here, while Israeli evidence of Hamas's atrocities needs to be authenticated through the UN's rigorous triangular verification process? As we count our injured, missing, and murdered in the wake of the October 7th massacre, we are again learning just what a long process it is to draw up an accurate and reliable list of civilian casualties, even with the most sophisticated capabilities in place. Yet, Hamas's so-called Ministry of Health is always able to immediately determine the number of injured or dead after every incident. Does it not make you ask yourselves whether there is any truth to Hamas's numbers that the UN is so quick to parrot? The UN has no system to verify the lies of terrorists. I said it and I'm saying it again now. To the UN, genocidal terrorists are more trustworthy than the law-abiding democracy of Israel. For the UN, thousands of terror attacks against Israelis in the West Bank and elsewhere are not important enough to be reported upon, whereas marginal cases of extremist violence become the main focus of an urgent council briefing. The poisonous bias of UN agencies truly knows no bounds. Council members, this body has been weaponized to brand the side defending itself against terror as the source of the problem. Rather than advancing real solutions for combating murderous terrorist organizations, this council is focusing on Israel's counter-terror operations in Judea and Samaria. So I want to make the facts clear. Every single one of Israel's military operations in Judea and Samaria has one goal and one goal only: to neutralize ticking terror time bombs. Over 80% of the Palestinian fatalities during Israel's counter-terror operations were known and armed terrorists. Over 80%, and we have the names. But the UN refuses to verify the facts. And this council immediately accepts the libelous numbers which are detached from the context of the war against terror. As a result of this week's mission in Tulkarem, just one example, which targeted Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas terror infrastructure, the IDF seized many rockets and weapons and uncovered an explosive lab. Do you think that Israel wishes to risk the lives of our soldiers by entering these Palestinian cities? Do you truly think we want to put our troops in harm's way? Of course not. Sadly, the only reason Israel is forced to carry out these operations is because the Palestinian Authority refuses to root out the jihadist terrorists themselves. Israel will always defend itself. We will always take action against threats to our citizens, just as any of your countries would. And if the Palestinian Authority stands idly by, Israel will act. If you are truly impartial, the truth about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very simple. And Israel's former Prime Minister, Golda Meir, summed it up in the past with perfect clarity. And I quote, "If the Arabs, in our case the Palestinians, lay down their weapons today, there would be no more violence. If the Jews put down their weapons today, there would be no more Israel. And I think you all know it in your hearts. Ever since the UN adopted the partition plan in 1947, every enemy of Israel who laid down their arms and chose to live side by side with us was met with immediate coexistence and peace. It is not by chance that the conflict with the Palestinians continues to this day. It is not because of Israeli military operations. It is not because of extremist violence. It is solely because of Palestinian terror and Palestinian incitement against our right to exist as a Jewish state. It is the sheer evil of Hamas that prefers to annihilate Israel while oppressing Gazans. It is the pay-for-slave policy of the Palestinian Authority and their indoctrination to jihad. And sadly, it is also the indifference of the UN and this Council to their heinous crimes. Time and again, this Council refuses to address the real obstacles and continues to dedicate time and energy to discussions that will bear no fruit. It's sad, truly sad. Dear colleagues, this Council is suffering from the streetlight effect. What is this effect, you may be wondering? So I'll remind you. A drunk man is stumbling around under a streetlight at night looking for his keys that he lost. A police officer approaches him and begins to help him search. After a couple of minutes, the police officer turns to the man and asks, I can't see your keys anywhere. Are you sure that you lost them here under the street lamp? The man turns to the officer and says, no, I lost them in the park down the road. I'm only looking for them here because this area isn't dark. So, distinguished council members, you are constantly being dragged underneath the streetlight. The distortion of UN agencies also drag you underneath the same streetlight. But there is nothing to be found under the streetlight. It's just easier to spend your time underneath it. Today, you have been dragged here again by the Arab League to give you the impression that the core of the conflict is not Palestinian terror, but Israel's acts of self-defense from Palestinian terror. Rather than spend this Council's valuable time discussing the only way to resolve the conflict, you are being briefed by vehemently biased anti-Israel briefers. The Council has never invited a briefer who is truly impartial or can say even one word of criticism against the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian leadership. This is why you are being falsely told that Israel's actions are the obstacle to peace, while Palestinian terror is hardly even mentioned, let alone discussed or addressed. Mr. President, if this Council's noble cause is to bring peace and security to the Middle East, I suggest it start with the situation at hand, namely Hamas, Hezbollah, their Iranian puppet masters, and all other genocidal jihadists threatening stability in the region. And there is only one solution to ending this war immediately, the war in Gaza. The Hamas terrorists must turn themselves in and release all hostages. This is the only solution, and this is precisely what this Council should be focused on advancing. Can the Council unite to back this solution? Sadly not. The Council cannot even come together to condemn the atrocities of October 7th. It is heartbreaking to see this Council not taking any constructive steps to end the war in Gaza. But it is particularly heart-wrenching to see the Council's inaction towards freeing our hostages from Hamas. It is shameful that the suffering of innocents, women, babies, the elderly, who were kidnapped from their beds, have become a footnote to this Council, to the Secretary General, to the International Red Cross, and to all UN bodies. I reiterate, calling for their release is not enough. The world must remember them every day. They committed no crime, and now they are locked away in a dark terror tunnel in Gaza. While the UN may choose indifference, Israel will not stop until we bring them home. Our hostages will not be forgotten, The world and the people of Gaza must know their names in order to remember why the war in Gaza is ongoing and will continue until we bring all of the hostages home. These are our hostages, and for them we will never stop fighting. And I want to read their names here. Tamir Adar, Alon Ahal, Yosef Chaim Ochanuna, Dror Or, Avinatan Or, Tomer Yaakov Achmias, Guy Iluz, Muhammad El Atrash, Liri Elbag, Yitzhak El Garat, Yosef Yusuf El Ziyadana, Hamza El Ziyadana, Idan Alexander, Farachan El Kadi, Ronen Engel, Matan Engerst, Aviv Atzili, Noah Argamani, Karina Arayev, Elkana Buchbut, Yogev Buchshtev, Amit Esther Buskila, Kfir Bibas, Yarden Bibas, Ariel Bibas, Ehud Ben Amir, Ron Binyamin, Agam Berger, Kirill Brodeski, Saar Baruch, Uriel Baruch, Rom Broslavski, Ziv Berman, Gali Berman, Almong Jian, Ran Guili, Menachem Meni Godard, Hirsch Goldberg Polin, Oren Goldin, Romy Gonen, Maya Goren, Daniel Gilboa, Guy Gilboa Dalal, Yitzhak Galaranter, Carmel Gat, Shaked Dahan, Evyatar David, Emily Damari, Oz Daniel, Ori Danino, Alexander Danzig, Sagi Dekel Chen, Yair Horn, Eitan Horn, Inbal Heyman, Louis Herr, Maxim Harkin, Omer Vinkret, Shlomi Ziv, Aryeh Zalmanovich, Gad Chagai, Tal Chaimi, Asaf Hamami, Itai Chen, Alexander Trofnov, Dolev Yahud, Arbel Yahud, Ohad Yahalomi, Yair Yaakov, Eden Yerushalmi, Nimrod Cohen, Elia Cohen, Segev Khalfon, Ravid Aryeh Katz, Alex Alexander Lubanov, Naama Levi, Eitan Levi, Or Levi, Shai Levinson, Shani Luke, Eliakim Libman, Judy Lin, Oded Lifshitz, Gad Moshe Moses, Avraham Monder, Eitan Mor, Omri Miran, Shlomo Mansur, Yoram Metzger, Eliyahu Margalit, Simon Marman, Omer Maxim Nutra, Michel Nissenbaum, Tamir Nimrodi, Itai Svirsky, Kit Siegel, Shiri Silverman Bibas, Yonatan Samarno, Almog Sarusi, Tzachi Idan, Nadav Poplavel, Chaim Peri, Daniel Shimon Peretz, Matan Tsangauker, Andrei Kozlov, David Konyo, Ariel Konyo, Amiram Cooper, Bar Cooperstein, Ofra Kedar, Ofer Calderon, Elad Katsir, Lior Rodaif, Tal Shoam, Doron Steinbrecher, Omer Shem Tov, Yossi Sharabi, Eliyahu Sharabi, Orion Hernandez Radu, Bipin Jushi, Surasa Klamnar, Joshua Molel Loito, Sonthaya Okarasar, Natapong Pinata, Sudthithak Rinthalak, Banawat Sayataso, Wachara Sriaun, Sathiasan Suwanakam, Pongax Dataema. These are our hostages, and for them we will never stop fighting. We are fighting for their release, and you too, distinguished council members, should be doing the same. Thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement.
Daré ahora la palabra.
I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to say at the outset that there hasn't been a council meeting on this subject when the council hasn't collectively demanded for the urgent release of all hostages held in the Gaza Strip. In fact, the resolution adopted last week by this council, penned by the United Arab Emirates, demanded for their urgent release and for medical access to be made immediately. Mr. President, I'd like to thank all the briefers here today for their powerful statements, underscoring why the UAE called for this urgent meeting on the very viability of the two-state solution and stability in our region. In this latest war of this decades-long conflict, it is clear that we are at a crossroads. Many of the countries represented in this room, mine included, have to make bold and perhaps uncomfortable decisions at this moment. The alternative is the hellscape of Gaza expanded into the West Bank, Israel, Lebanon, and other parts of the Middle East. Gaza in 2023 demonstrates the immense capacity of humans to inflict untold horror on other humans. Advanced military systems have intensified beyond imagination the scale and pace of the death and destruction. This is a war of extremists, radicalizing youth in schools, universities, and streets in the Middle East and beyond. Since the horrific attacks of October 7th on Israel and the war that followed, We were told in and outside this chamber that Israel's defense would decisively achieve a clearly defined endgame while following the rules of war, because that is what democracies do. After nearly 3 months and 21,000 Palestinians killed, those declarations and commitments are a fallacy. We've all been in frequent contact with humanitarians on the ground in Gaza, and their dystopian accounts, unbearable to hear, let alone live through, are known to you all. Civilians move up and down this strip of land in a desperate, futile search for safety, too often killed in the process. 2,000-pound munitions, bombs not used in half a century, are dropped on Gaza, risking the lives of more than 2 million Palestinians. And, it must be said, the over 129 hostages that remain in the strip. In the face of this carnage, we have all rediscovered the urgency of achieving the two-state solution as a way forward out of this. But this reawakened sense of historic and moral responsibility must manifest itself in decisive action, with clear guardrails defined to keep this on track. It must recognize that the violence visited by Israeli settlers on Palestinians in the West Bank is the logical endpoint of a settler enterprise that has been swallowing up Palestinian land for decades. With over 300 dead in the West Bank, 80 of them children, and escalating Israeli raids across Palestinian towns and cities, it is clear that far more tectonic shifts are underway than Gaza alone. When leaders proudly claim that their life's work was the prevention of the two-state solution, when they openly call for the expulsion of Palestinians from their land, when they routinely threaten other countries with a fate similar to Gaza, we must recognize the need here for a fundamental reset. This war is already different, and how it ends must be different. There must be an international presence to monitor the ceasefire for it to hold. And there needs to be a plan towards separation that starts, rather than ends, with a Palestinian state. Bold steps like this are required, else how would Palestinians, subjected to the unrestrained slaughter of this war, turn around and over the bodies of their kin and rubble of their homes stretch their hand out to make peace? The late Yitzhak Rabin explained that sanctifying human life, as the Book of Books commands, requires not armored plating or tanks or planes or concrete fortifications, but peace. Less than a year later, an extremist killed him after a rally in central Tel Aviv, where Israeli and Palestinian flags were flown by thousands, yearning to sanctify their lives and the lives of their neighbors. All of us have learned, some more recently than others, that we cannot make Israelis or Palestinians choose what we want them to do, but we can choose. We can choose to admit that we all know this to be true. What is happening in Gaza does not meet this or any other language's definition of self-defense. We can choose to make the hard and necessary sacrifices for peace and security to ensure that once the war stops, it never restarts. We can choose to impose a prohibitive political, legal, and financial cost on the extremist settler expansion and violence that has ravaged the West Bank. We can choose to recognize that for the Jewish homeland to truly realize its founding aspirations, it cannot be built on top of an occupation. We can choose to deny extremists and their many enablers, however they sound or look, the legitimacy of leadership and our backing. We can choose to understand that October 7th evoked moments of visceral fear and vulnerability among Jews in Israel and around the world. We can choose to finally uphold the promise of never again and ensure its universality. We can choose to learn the lessons of this ancient playbook and refuse to allow it to unfold once more in generational hatred and grievance. Nothing about this conflict was inevitable. Nothing about where we go from here is inevitable. At every moment there was and is choice. But we must make those decisions now and use the collective courage of the countries in this room and outside it to change course. We must give an alternative vision of hope against the nihilistic extremism raging that wishes to see our region swallowed whole in this wave. Thank you.
Agradezco a la representante.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would like to thank our three briefers for their helpful remarks this morning. The United States shares the concern regarding the sharp increase in violence by extremist settlers in the West Bank and the unprecedented number of Palestinian fatalities both there and in Gaza over the last 3 months. Colleagues, we know 2023 has been the deadliest year for the Palestinians in the West Bank. As we have said repeatedly, the death of any civilian, whether they were one of the individuals killed by Hamas terrorists on October 7th in Israel, or one of the Palestinians killed in the West Bank or Gaza, is a tragedy, period. The United States continues to stress to the Israeli government the importance of preventing extremist settler violence, as well as investigating and holding accountable those who commit acts of violence. To that end, the United States will continue to implement visa restrictions as announced on December 5th, targeting individuals believed to have been involved in or meaningfully contributed to undermining peace, security, or stability in the West Bank. And we have already taken steps to impose visa restrictions on dozens of individuals under this policy. These restrictions reinforce the United States' long-held belief: advancing settlements in the West Bank undermines the prospects of a future Palestinian state and a two-state solution. As do any actions that undermine stability in the West Bank, including attacks by Israeli settlers against Palestinians and Palestinian attacks against Israelis. As President Biden has repeatedly said, those attacks are unacceptable. Let us be clear. A two-state solution where Israelis and Palestinians live side by side in peace is the path to peace. That path to peace is not a smooth nor a fast one. And the ongoing construction of settlements and increase in violence in the West Bank makes this challenging journey even more difficult. In addition, we also know the continued control of Gaza by Hamas, a group that has dedicated its entire existence to the elimination of Israel, precludes a pathway to a viable two-state solution, in which Israel's security is guaranteed and the Palestinian people can fully realize their aspirations. Colleagues, as we work toward a lasting peace, we must all continue to call out and condemn dehumanizing rhetoric which persists at alarming levels on all sides. There can be no justification for terrorism or attacks on civilians, and we condemn horrific Hamas's glorification of violence. And yet, some members of this council cannot bring themselves to condemn Hamas's brutal terrorist attacks on October 7th. It's outrageous and beneath the dignity of this council. Moreover, it is striking that even as, again, we hear many countries urging the end to this conflict, which we would all like to see, we hear very few demands of Hamas to stop hiding behind civilians, lay down its arms, and surrender. How can it be we hear so few demands directed at Hamas? We all need to press Hamas to do what's necessary to end the conflict it's set in motion. Which brings me to the dire humanitarian situation facing the Palestinian people. Last week, in adopting a humanitarian-focused resolution, this council spoke out about this crisis, and we made clear aid must be scaled up and humanitarian actors on the ground must be supported and protected. Now we need to see those words realized on the ground. And for our part, the United States will continue to lead and work with regional partners, humanitarian organizations, and the UN to get aid into the hands of those in need. To that end, we welcome the appointment of Sigrid Kaag, who will serve as the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. She has the depth of experience and relationships in the region to hit the ground running. We look forward to coordinating closely with Ms. Kaag and the UN on efforts to accelerate and streamline the delivery of life-saving humanitarian relief to Palestinian civilians living in Gaza. We also expect, per her title, she will play an important role in coordinating reconstruction efforts in Gaza. We continue to look to Israel to enable humanitarian actors' distribution of assistance inside Gaza, including with a strong and responsive deconfliction and telecommunications mechanisms. Such steps should have a meaningful impact as we look to increase aid flows to Gaza. Last week's resolution also emphasized all parties must respect international humanitarian law. And, as we've made clear time and time again, this includes Israel, which should take additional actions to avoid civilian harm. As Secretary Blinken noted last week, it is clear the conflict needs to move to a lower intensity phase, and we would like to see a shift to more targeted operations with a smaller number of forces focused on dealing with the leadership of Hamas and the tunnel network. Such a shift should help reduce harm to civilians. Of course, another important humanitarian dimension of the conflict is the hostage situation. Israel has been clear it would welcome returning to a pause and the further release of hostages. Hamas, therefore, remains a problem. They reneged on commitments they made during the first pause for hostage releases, and we question whether they are in fact willing to resume this effort. We remain engaged in efforts to secure another pause and once again get hostages moving out of Gaza. Finally, the United States reiterates regional actors should not seek to widen this conflict. We join other members of the Security Council in condemning the Houthis' attack on commercial shipping vessels in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. We call for this council to speak out and take action against these attacks without delay. We are also concerned by the renewed violence along the border between Israel and Lebanon and underscore to both governments the need to address the situation through diplomacy rather than force. And we continue to condemn Iran's support for partner and proxy groups throughout the region. Colleagues, we met just 2 days before the new year. We meet just 2 days before the new year. And the past year, and especially the last few months, have been immensely difficult and painful for Israelis and Palestinians first and foremost. But for all of us who have watched devastating images of suffering pour out across our screens. Our goal in the year to come must be to work toward a lasting peace and a two-state solution. So the next generation and generations to come need not experience the devastation of the last year and can finally live side by side in states of their own with equal measures of security, freedom, opportunity, and dignity. And I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we're grateful to the United Arab Emirates for convening today's meeting. We're grateful to today's keynote speakers, Khaled Khiari, Marwana Morshere, and Itai Epstein for their interesting and valuable briefing. We are following with concern the situation in the West Bank, which continues to be very tense, and where, against the background of the bloody operation by Israel in Gaza, we're seeing continued continued operations by Israeli security forces and by violent settlers, which not only threaten with a large-scale humanitarian disaster, but also to spread the crisis to the rest of the region. Lebanon and Syria find themselves under threat. In addition to that, increasing tensions are seen in Iraq and Yemen, whereas Egypt and Jordan are facing unprecedented risks of a massive exodus of Palestinians from Gaza and from the West Bank. Mr. President, according to UN statistics, since the 7th of October in the West Bank, including in East Jerusalem, Israeli military and settlers have killed 302 Palestinians, including 79 children. That's 60% of all Palestinians killed on the West Bank this year. Overall, their numbers reached 504 people, so that 2023 was the bloodiest year for the inhabitants of the West Bank. The number of the wounded as a result of the actions of the Israeli military and settlers are slightly less than 4,000 Palestinians, including 576 children. In the context of violence in the West Bank, we'd like to, as an aside, stress the fact that the multiple security operations by Israel on this part of occupied territory began long before the terrorist attack of the 7th of October. And which, once again, that terrorist attack, I want to stress once again, we categorically condemn. And these raids began without any linkage to the terrorist threat, which the Israelis have used as a justification to conduct an unprecedented in its scale an operation to clean up Gaza, which has led to over 21,000 killed, and including 144 UN staff members, including staff members of UNRWA and others. In addition to that, 311 medical workers and 103 journalists have become victims. Against that background, we're seeing confiscation of the property of Palestinians and demolition of homes, and there are still resolutions 2334 is being violated, and settlers are being expanded in Jerusalem. Mr. President, our most urgent task is to stop the bloodshed and ensure conditions for providing humanitarian assistance to all those in need on occupied Palestinian territories. Unfortunately, our multiple efforts, together with like-minded member states, to have the Security Council adopt a resolution with a demand of an immediate comprehensive ceasefire, even for humanitarian purposes, are met with harsh opposition from the United States. Such a policy by Washington derives from its one-sided and selfish position aimed at derailing the Middle East peace process and cover up any actions by their regional ally Israel. In essence, the United States today remain the only state in the world, other than Israel, opposing the international consensus about the fact that there is no alternative to humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. As a result, since the beginning of the crisis, the Council has only adopted two resolutions emasculated by Washington and toothless, resolutions 2712 and 2720, which lack any direct demands addressed to ceasefire, and this has been something that has been demanded by leaders of all international humanitarian agencies, including the Secretary General. The relevant language in these resolutions, even at the negotiating stage, has been categorically excised by the United States. The U.S. delegation accepted only language weakened as much as possible, which it will in no way prevent the continuation of the military operation by Israel. As a result, exclusively as a result of U.S. position, the Security Council, as the main UN organ to maintain international peace and security, hasn't been able to fulfill its direct mandate for 3 months now. This kind of unaccepted situation highlights the obvious double standards of our American colleagues with regard to the crisis in Gaza and other regions of the world. The Russian Federation abstained in voting on both resolutions as a reaction to the appeals of the Palestinian and Arab representatives. At the same time, we value our historically close relationships both with Palestinians and with Israelis, and we'd like to confirm our unchanged approaches. We condemn the terrorist attack against Israel of the 7th of October, which nevertheless should not and cannot serve as justification for the continued collective punishment of peaceful Palestinians. The permanent representative of Israel has just listed the names of all the remaining hostages, Israeli hostages. I want to just recall that, as our colleague from the United Arab Emirates just said, and in all our statements in the Council and in all our products, the Security Council has called for their immediate release. At the same time, I'd like to ask, how many hostages have been freed during the Israeli operations in Gaza? And how many compared to the 7-day humanitarian truce? Compared to the answer is obvious. And how has the goal of freeing the hostages contribute to the indiscriminate killing of Palestinian women and children? So this is why we have always been in favor of an immediate ceasefire and as an essential condition to ensuring the security of the civilian population, providing unimpeded humanitarian access to all those in need, the release of all the detained individuals, including hostages, and returning the process of resolving the conflict towards a diplomatic track. So far, we're not seeing any of this happen, but it's important to start working on restoring a political horizon in the process of the Palestinian-Israeli peace process, on the recognized international legal framework that envisions the creation of an independent Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as capital, coexisting in peace and security with Israel. Only this kind of balanced, impartial approach based on international law, rather than attempts to attain economic pacts with a number of Arab states and Israel, without a just solution to the Palestinian problem, will make it possible to achieve a sustainable peace in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari, Mr. Mwasher and Mr. Epstein for their remarks. They truly illustrate the precarious situation we continue to witness in the region. The catastrophic humanitarian situation and continued state of hostilities in Gaza is untenable. It is leading to unprecedented levels of human suffering, with thousands of civilians being killed and thousands more injured and maimed. The continued bombardment of Middle Gaza, including the airstrikes on 3 refugee camps, is especially worrying. These attacks follow instructions from Israeli forces for residents from the south of Wadi Gaza to move to Middle Gaza. The resulting scenes, including strikes that hit residential buildings in Al-Maghazi refugee camp, are truly harrowing. On several occasions, Malta has unreservedly condemned Hamas's acts of terror, including the heinous attacks of 7th October. Terror has no justification, and this Council must also be clear in rejecting it. We once again call for the release of all remaining hostages safely and unconditionally. At the same time, Malta has also reiterated Israel's right to protect her citizens. However, we continue to stress that it is paramount that any such actions need to be taken with respect for international humanitarian law. The principles of international humanitarian law, including distinction, proportionality, and precaution, must be respected at all times. All parties are obliged to ensure that all measures to protect civilians are taken. As highlighted by OCHA, most people in Gaza have been displaced on multiple occasions. The civilian population continues to suffer limited food supplies and lack basic survival items. 40% are at risk of famine. Despite this desperate situation, continued hostilities continue to impede the delivery of aid. In these circumstances, the full implementation of all provisions of Resolution 2712 and 2720 and the establishment of an immediate humanitarian ceasefire are the only ways to avoid further death and destruction. Malta remains deeply concerned with the rapidly deteriorating situation in the West Bank, including the scale of recent Israeli military operations in the West Bank. This threatens to lead to even more violence. Malta urges Israel to exercise utmost restraint, including in the usage of live ammunition and explosive weapons, to abide by international human rights law and to prioritize the protection of civilians. In this context, we stress our concern with the recent OHCHR report, which reports on the use of military tactics, disproportionate force, and imposition of movement restrictions in the West Bank. These measures impact broad segments of the Palestinian population. We echo the call of UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for Israeli authorities to take clear and effective steps towards ceasing such practices. We also remain deeply concerned about demolitions, the forcible transfer of Palestinian communities, and the resurgence of illegal settler encroachment and violence. Settlements are illegal under international law and constitute an obstacle to peace. Attacks by Israeli settlers against Palestinian residents and properties are inexcusable and cannot be met with impunity. The continued recurrence of these acts only threatens the viability of a two-state solution, which remains the only path to a lasting and sustainable peace in the Middle East. Provocations and increased tensions around the holy sites in Jerusalem is another factor that only serves to exacerbate tensions. The integrity of the holy sites and the legal and historic status quo must be upheld and fully respected at all times. Any act that undermines this is unacceptable. President, the situation poses a serious threat to regional peace with international repercussions. Continued and escalatory skirmishes along the Blue Line continue to raise tensions. We strongly call on all parties, including non-state actors in the region, to exercise restraint, including in their messaging, de-escalate and respect the norms of international law. The deteriorating maritime security situation in the Red Sea is also of deep concern. Avoiding a regional conflagration is of utmost importance and must be avoided at all costs. President, this violence continues to push us further away from a political horizon to this conflict. Malta reaffirms its unwavering commitment to a two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, addressing the legitimate aspirations of both sides, with Jerusalem as the future capital of two states living side by side in peace and security, in line with relevant Security Council resolutions and internationally agreed parameters. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I thank Mr. Chiari, Mr. Moasher, and Mr. Epstein for their briefings. France remains deeply concerned by the ongoing humanitarian crisis in Gaza, which continues to worsen. I'll insist on 3 points. The priority must go to the immediate implementation of a lasting ceasefire with the help of all regional and international partners. That's what the President of the Republic, Emmanuel Macron, proposed firmly. It's urgent to deliver more humanitarian aid to the civilian populations in Gaza that need it more than ever, and to guarantee without restrictions access for this aid. I welcome the engagement of the United Nations on the ground, including UNRWA personnel. France calls on Israel to facilitate the delivery of aid to the whole of the Gaza Strip. The use of all means of access and movement must be facilitated, including through the complete opening of the Kerem Shala crossing. France supports the call of the UN to open useful crossings, including the Erez crossing in the north, the Israeli port of Ashdod, and a direct maritime corridor between Gaza and Cyprus. The 2 resolutions adopted by the Council over the last few weeks must be implemented. In this regard, France recalls that international humanitarian law must be implemented in all circumstances and by all. This Council has also expressly recalled this. France welcomes the appointment of the humanitarian coordinator for Gaza, Ms. Sigrid Kaag, and we ensure her that she will have our full support. France will continue to be fully involved at the humanitarian level and to provide humanitarian aid financially and materially through the civilian population in the Gaza Strip. President, responding to the humanitarian crisis is an urgent need, but this council can't be limited to solely addressing the symptoms of this crisis. My second point, therefore, refers to the attacks of the 7th of October and their consequences. All hostages must be released immediately and without conditions, as has been called for in resolutions 2712 and 2720, as was already mentioned here. This council must condemn the terrorist attacks committed by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October, including sexual violence. It's incomprehensible that this council has still not been able to do this. France will continue its action to impose sanctions against Hamas at the European level. President, finally, at the political level, France will continue to work to find a way out of the crisis based on the two-state solution. This solution is the only one that will enable the establishment of a fair and lasting peace. We must work to create a state for Palestinians. The Palestinian Authority has a central role to play in this process in the West Bank as in Gaza, which should be a part of this Palestinian state. It's paramount now to avoid a regional conflagration, and France is doing its utmost in this regard. The situation in the West Bank is deteriorating every day. The stability of Lebanon and the region requires full respect for Resolution 1701 by all parties. France roundly condemns the Houthi attacks against shipping vessels in the Red Sea. We will continue to be mobilized to contribute to maritime security in the region and to preserve freedom of navigation. Thank you.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank France for your statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ghana.
President, let me begin by thanking ASG Khaled Kyari and the other two briefers for their perspectives on the precarious and volatile security situation prevailing across the Middle East against the backdrop of the war in the Gaza Strip that has been ongoing since the horrific attacks of 7th October. We have also listened carefully to the representatives of the observer state of Palestine and the state of Israel and note their perspectives. Mr. President, in ordinary times, the end of the year should be a time of deep reflection and a period for renewing optimism and hope for the future. As it relates to Palestine, however, the unfolding events, including the growing risk of a regional spillover, have obscured the prospects for durable and sustainable peace and diminished the horizon for a viable pathway away from the brutality of war. Even as the Council meets, families in the region and beyond are in anguish. The fate of loved ones still held captive by Hamas remains uncertain, and over 21,000 civilians, mainly children and women, have been reported killed in the Gaza Strip, in addition to those killed on 7th October in Israel. With the grave situation in Gaza threatening even more lives, time is running out to avert a humanitarian catastrophe. We therefore welcome the Secretary General's expeditious appointment of Sigrid Kaag as the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator and encourage her efforts as mandated by the Council in paragraph 4 of Resolution 2720. We consider the success of the Senior Coordinator as critical for the intermediate goals that support the overall peace objectives for Palestine and urge the cooperation and support of all. We reiterate the demands of Resolution 2712 and 2720 for all parties to the conflict to comply with international law, including with respect to their conduct of hostilities and the protection of civilians and civilian objects, especially critical infrastructure such as schools and hospitals. Based on the expanding situation on the ground, we are constrained to reiterate our call for practical and urgent steps on the part of the parties to the conflict to protect civilians on both sides, including by taking constant care to spare them in military operations as required by the principles of international humanitarian law governing the use of force in armed conflict. Mr. President, Ghana, like all other delegations is worried about the forced displacement of the civilian population in the occupied Palestinian territories, including in the West Bank, resulting from the activities of nationalist settlers and Israeli security operations. The creation of illegal outposts and the demolition and seizure of Palestinian-owned structures do not only serve to stoke tensions and deepen mistrust, but diminish the prospects for sustainable peace in the Middle East. We urge Israel to enhance its investigations against nationalist crimes and to make the necessary administrative orders that would abate access of Israeli settlers and the consequential violence this generates. We are equally concerned about the actions of Palestinian armed groups that are threatening the security of Israel, including through the continuous firing of rockets into Israel and attacks against innocent civil Israeli citizens. We demand that all such actions and the opening of new front lines by Hamas, as well as cross-border incidents such as across the Blue Line and within the wider region, should stop. The war indeed must stop, and it must stop now. As we have stated previously, urgent efforts must be made by all sides, supported by the international community, to stop the present war, address the root causes of the conflict, promote dialogue, and find a peaceful resolution that ensures security, justice, and self-determination. At this crucial time, every voice of moderation and positive influence on the parties to help de-escalate the conflict and prevent its further spread in the region is needed. In this context, it would also be important for the PLO, as the recognized representative of all the Palestinian people, to activate its institutional authority in reinvigorating inclusive and accountable governance across the occupied territory of Palestine. Ghana believes that what is required is a deepened commitment to a negotiated two-state solution on the basis of the pre-1967 borders, with Jerusalem as a shared capital. As a council, we have an enduring responsibility to end the present conflict, bring the parties to the table of dialogue, and help deliver a secure and assured statehood for both Israel and Palestine sooner rather than later. The peace process must also resume in earnest without preconditions and with a clear and definite horizon. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al representante.
I thank the representative of Ghana for your statement, and I now give the floor to Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Brazil thanks Ecuador for convening this important meeting and the United Arab Emirates for their timely request. We also thank the briefers for their insightful and distressful updates and comments, shedding further light on the harrowing realities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Mr. President, I will make a first statement in the name of Brazil and Switzerland as informal co-focal points on conflict and hunger. I'll do this with regard to the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, on acute food insecurity in the Gaza Strip, published on December 21st. According to the report, more than 90% of Gaza's population is currently experiencing crisis-level food insecurity. Over 500,000 people are facing catastrophic hunger conditions. Almost 2 million people are either not meeting their daily food needs or are only meeting minimal nourishment requirements by selling their possessions. Virtually all households are skipping meals every day. Many families go entire days and nights without eating. Adults go hungry so children can eat. It is estimated that until February, the entire population in the Gaza Strip will face high levels of food insecurity. These levels of acute food insecurity are unprecedented in recent history. The risk of Gaza experiencing famine increases each day, with hostilities as the main driver. Crucial infrastructure such as bakeries, water reservoirs, agricultural lands, and fishing ports have been destroyed or severely damaged. Agricultural activities have collapsed. Access to adequate food, water, health services, and humanitarian aid has been severely disrupted in the Gaza Strip. The delivery of humanitarian assistance is hindered due to ongoing hostilities and large-scale devastation. We welcome the delivery of a first aid convoy by the World Food Programme from Jordan to Gaza, reaching 500,000 people with food assistance. This could pave the way for a sustained corridor allowing for expanded humanitarian assistance. Nevertheless, Only the resumption of commercial cargo moving into Gaza can ensure the much-needed scale-up to provide relief to the people in need. It is critical that the commercial and public sectors resume their activities in Gaza, including agricultural production, so that markets can replenish their shelves. The governing bodies of FAO and the World Food Programme, as well as the Committee on World Food Security, have also underscored their concern of Gaza's dire food security crisis in line with last week's IPS report. Mr. President, food is running out in the Gaza Strip. If people need to pay 5 to 10 times more for essential food items, such as flour and oil, we know that scarcity will affect the most vulnerable in catastrophic ways. This Council has adopted Resolutions 2712 and 2720, which call for increased humanitarian access and aid, as well as for urgent steps towards a sustainable cessation of hostilities. It is time that members of this Council use their influence to ensure that these provisions are implemented on the ground. When adopting Resolution 2417 5 years ago, the Council demonstrated its commitment to address conflict-induced food insecurity, including famine, while stressing the importance of full compliance with international humanitarian law by all parties. The resolution is clear in its condemnation of the unlawful denial of humanitarian access and depriving civilians of objects indispensable to their survival. As informal co-focal points, Switzerland and Brazil call upon the members of this Council to give their full attention to the information provided by the United Nations on the risk of conflict-induced famine and to do their utmost to prevent it. I will now make a statement on my Brazilian capacity. Mr. President, as we approach the conclusion of the Council's activities in 2023, we note with deep regret the continuation of the war in Gaza and the systematic worsening of the situation in the West Bank. 83 days into the conflict, despite the incredible amount of energy and resources that this Council has put into debating and negotiating a solution or at least some sort of ceasefire, the violence not only continues to rage unchecked across the occupied Palestinian territory, but grows more profound and more entrenched. It is causing a staggering loss of lives, an appalling number of wounded and of forcibly displaced people, an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, and the sad destruction of civil infrastructure and housing. The staggering and disproportionate figures speak volumes. Approximately 21,000 Palestinian lives have been lost, predominantly women and children, with children alone accounting for over 8,000 of these tragic deaths. The displacement crisis is equally alarming, with 1.9 million people, over 85% of the Gaza Strip's population, now looking for shelter. The deaths of over 140 UN staff and humanitarian workers, a sad and unprecedented toll, further compounds this calamity. We join the absolute majority of the international community in reiterating our call for an immediate ceasefire and the continuous provision of essential humanitarian aid to Gaza through all viable channels. We also stand in solidarity with all those mourning their dead in both Israel and Palestine. The healing of a tragedy of such proportions will demand an enormous effort and cannot be taken for sure. Moreover, the ramifications of the conflict in Gaza extend well beyond its borders, stoking violence and extremism. This includes rising hostilities on the Lebanese-Israeli border and in the Red Sea. Brazil continues to urge all relevant parties and member states to prevent further escalation of the conflict. Mr. President, Brazil also observes with concern the continued disregard of pertinent United Nations Security Council and United Nations General Assembly resolutions on this ongoing tragic chapter of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This, coupled with the Council's inability to effect tangible change, perpetuates a perception that might take precedence over right in the Middle East, and that international law may be violated there with impunity. This deeply worrisome state of affairs cannot be allowed to go on. It can only lead to a reinforcement of the cycle of violence and resentment and a lack of trust in the international community. The international community remains incapable of effectively reacting after 75 years of a conflict that has proven to be of consequences far beyond the region. The situation in the West Bank exemplifies our concerns. As reported today, the region is teetering on the brink of an irreversible escalation. Tensions remain high with continued settler violence, raids, and drone attacks, including against refugee camps such as in Nur Shams in Tulkarem. Exchanges of fire and the bulldozing and demolition of Palestinian houses and humanitarian structures have also been all too frequent. Besides all the disproportionate and unjustified violence and civil casualties, particularly of women and children, it is appalling that settlement activities have continued and expanded throughout the occupied Palestinian territory and in defiance of the authority of this Council. We again condemn the displacement of Palestinians from their homes, which only have worsened after the attacks of 7th October. We are also concerned with the intensification of settler violence in the West Bank, as well as with demolitions, eviction orders, and other attacks against Palestinian households, including in East Jerusalem. Let's state it again and again. These settlements are illegal under international law and must be stopped and reversed. This is a precondition for any agreement that will ensure peace and stability for both Israelis and Palestinians on a durable basis. Our collective responsibility is to pursue tirelessly a lasting peace in the Middle East. The world cannot afford to continue to disregard the legitimate aspirations of Palestinians and Israelis to live in peace and security. We must all make every effort to speak with one voice and find a new political horizon. This includes adhering unconditionally to international law and international humanitarian law, protecting civilians, securing the immediate and unconditional release of hostages, and ensuring the effective and unimpeded provision of humanitarian aid to the hundreds of thousands in dire need of it. Our commitment to ending hostilities and alleviating suffering must remain unyielding. In this regard, Brazil welcomes the appointment by the Secretary General of Ms. Sigrid Kaag as the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, as mandated by Resolution 2720, and look forward to her contributions towards improving the lives of the most vulnerable. Mr. President, throughout Brazil's tenure of the Council, and particularly following the October 7th terrorist attacks against Israel, we have unwaveringly advocated for peace and a sustainable future for both Palestinians and Israelis. Brazil's efforts in this Council since the beginning of the crisis, guided by the humanitarian imperative, sought to promote effective action to prevent the escalation of violence and ensure the protection of civilians. Just as we have done in the Council, we shall continue elsewhere to reaffirm our resolute commitment to a two-state solution with a viable state of Palestine living side by side with Israel in peace and security within mutually agreed and internationally recognized borders. Thank you.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of Brazil for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
I thank the briefers for their briefing. More than 80 days have passed since the outbreak of this round of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and more than 2 million innocent people in Gaza have plunged into an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. This is in spite of the fact that both the General Assembly and the Security Council have respectively adopted a number of resolutions strongly calling for a ceasefire, strongly calling for an end to the collective punishment of the innocent people of Gaza, and strongly calling for compliance by the occupying power with the international law and international humanitarian law. Sadly, the blockade and siege of Gaza, the violence and killings of civilians, and the raids and apprehensions in the West Bank continue unabated. As Mr. Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, said, the Palestinian people are being subjected to dehumanization. The international community must pool all its efforts to promote a ceasefire, mitigate the catastrophe, and save lives. First, The protraction of the war will only cause more casualties on both sides, exacerbate the obstacles to humanitarian assistance, and undermine the prospects for a political settlement. There is no safe place in Gaza, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who have been repeatedly forced to move have nowhere else to go. Secretary General Guterres has repeatedly warned that Gaza, under bombing and shelling, do not have the conditions for UN agencies to carry out humanitarian relief. We urge Israel to immediately cease its indiscriminate military attacks and collective punishment of the people of Gaza, and to provide the necessary conditions for humanitarian agencies to carry out their assistance work in Gaza. Second, the current humanitarian situation in Gaza is extremely dire, with life-saving supplies nearly exhausted, the medical system paralyzed, social order on the verge of collapse. Tens of thousands of pregnant women facing the threat of extreme starvation, newborns being deprived of feeding because of their mother's malnutrition, and a tragic, predictable, and man-made catastrophe unfolding in Gaza. We welcome the appointment by the Secretary General of the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, call on all parties to effectively and fully implement Council Resolution 2720, and look forward to the early establishment of a mechanism to ensure the safe and unimpeded entry of adequate humanitarian supplies into Gaza. Third, Israel's settlement activities in the West Bank and other occupied territories and its continued escalation of raids, searches, and settler violence constitute a grave violation of Council Resolution 2334 and erode the basis of the two-state solution. We urge Israel to uphold its responsibilities as the occupying power, cease all settlement activities, curb the escalating settler violence, and thoroughly investigate and hold perpetrators accountable for all relevant incidents. Fourth, the crux of the protracted Palestinian-Israeli issue lies in the failure to implement the two-state solution and the failure to guarantee the fundamental rights of the Palestinian people. We advocate the convening of an international peace conference that is larger in scale, scope, and effectiveness, so as to expedite the formation of a timetable and roadmap for the implementation of this two-state solution. We support Palestine's full membership in the UN and the early resumption of direct negotiations between Palestine and Israel. I thank you, Mr. Chair.
Agradezco.
I thank the representative of China for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon. Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank all the briefers for their statements. A week after the adoption of the resolution on the increase and monitoring of humanitarian aid to Gaza, the situation remains very alarming, not only on the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank, with an increase in the intensity of violence. The terrible outcome of deaths among civilians and displacement among the civilian population continues to grow. My country is very concerned by the latest developments on the ground, which not only threaten the viability of a two-state solution by making even more improbable the prospect of a constructive dialogue between Israel and Palestine, but also threaten a call for conflagration of violence in the entire region. The risk of the spread of the conflict is real in light of the multiple reprisal attacks by the Houthis of Yemen against commercial ships. My country strongly condemns such actions and calls on the Houthis to immediately cease attacks in violation of international law. Gabon has up to now supported any initiative aimed at giving hope, reviving hope and saving human lives and contributing to the improvement for civilian populations and de-escalation. Resolution 2720, adopted by the Council on increase in monitoring of assistance to Gaza, is an opportunity for all parties, in particular, to achieve the following: reaffirm that the Gaza Strip is part and parcel of Palestinian territory. Gabon welcomes the nomination by the Secretary General of Madam Sigrid Kaag as Coordinator for Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance for Gaza. We also call for the implementation of all the relevant provisions of Resolution 2720 and 2712 of this Council. Gabon also demands the unconditional release of all hostages. We will never stop repeating that the solution to the conflict must be political and diplomatic through dialogue and good faith negotiations, and while ensuring that the legitimate concerns of all parties are taken into consideration. We must step up our efforts to find a just and lasting solution based on a two-state solution. Thank you very much. I thank the representative of Gabon for her statement, and I now give the floor to Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, I also thank Mr. Kihari, Mr. Moashu, and Mr. Epstein for their respective briefings. Just 1 week ago, we adopted Security Council Resolution 2720 in the hope it would bring about substantial improvements in the humanitarian situation through expanding the delivery of humanitarian relief to the people in Gaza. However, it seems there has been little impact on the ground so far, amid the heavy fighting and airstrikes resulting in the displacement of around 90% of Gaza's population. People in Gaza struggle for survival every single day, with barely any access to food and water. The hospitals in Gaza are operating far beyond their capacities in unimaginable conditions. The UN recently said 40% of the population of Gaza is at risk of famine. What is happening in Gaza is nothing short of a humanitarian catastrophe. Israel's troops have expanded their ground operations across most of the Gaza Strip, including the central town of Dar al-Baraha. In the Maghazi refugee camp, many people were reportedly killed by airstrikes. On the other hand, Hamas is continuing to launch indiscriminatory rocket attacks against Israel, causing damages to innocent citizens even today. This must be stopped, and all remaining hostages must be released immediately. Mr. President, it's a fact that the UN and other humanitarian actors face various obstacles in facilitating aid delivery to and throughout Gaza. The Secretary General has stated an effective aid operation in Gaza requires first and foremost security and staff logistical capacity and the resumption of commercial activity. We therefore strongly urge all parties to act in good faith based on Resolution 2720 and 2712. In particular, Israel must do its utmost to remove these obstacles and constraints. The opening of Kerem Shalom border crossing was a step forward, but the continued airstrikes are one of the major impediments to the humanitarian operations. In this regard, we welcome the appointment of Ms. Sigrid Kaag as a senior humanitarian and reconstruction coordinator for Gaza, and we will support all her efforts to accelerate delivery of life-saving humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in Gaza. Mr. President, the serious spillover of the conflict is already happening. There has been increased cross-border fighting between Israel and Hezbollah across the Blue Line, posing a grave risk to regional stability. The Houthis' continued attacks on merchant and commercial vessels pose a grave threat to maritime security. We strongly demand the Houthis to immediately cease such attacks and release Japanese-operated Galaxy Leader cargo ship and its crew. Regarding the situation in occupied West Bank, we strongly condemn mass arbitrary arrests, settler violence, and even unlawful killings that are widely reported. We urge the Israeli government to take every measure to prevent those acts which would further undermine prospects for a just and lasting political solution. We also affirmed the important role of Hashemite custodianship over the holy sites in Jerusalem. Mr. President, in conclusion, while we recognize all diplomatic efforts, including a proposal that is reportedly made by Egypt, the Council also needs to unite to bring an end to this ongoing tragedy. We must keep the spirit of two-state solution alive and recall that this remains the only viable path for peace, security, and prosperity in the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement. I give the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And let me join others in thanking ASG Chiari, Mr. Muasha, and Mr. Epstein for their briefings today. President, let me start with the humanitarian crisis. The 21 December IPC report records that more people are in Phase 5, famine, in Gaza than in the rest of the world combined. Yesterday, I spoke to the Save the Children country director in the OPTs. He told me that 4 in 10 of those killed in Gaza so far are children. That is close to 8,500 children dead. For those injured and surviving, nearly 2/3 of homes and schools are damaged or destroyed. Many more will die from attacks, from disease, and from famine if we do not act to stop this humanitarian catastrophe. And so, with the adoption of Resolution 2720, this Council sent an important signal of commitment to support the UN to deliver desperately needed aid. And we very much welcome the appointment of Sigrid Kaag as the UN Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza. Our own appointment of a UK representative for humanitarian affairs in the OPTs underscores our commitment to address the humanitarian crisis. Second, on security. President, we remain resolute in our commitment to Israel's security and the need to address the threat from Hamas. But too many civilians have been killed. Israel must comply with international humanitarian law and differentiate clearly between terrorists and civilians. The situation in the occupied West Bank underlines the urgent need to make progress towards peace. The UK is clear that Israel must stop settler violence immediately and hold perpetrators accountable. We also continue to call on Israel to adhere to their commitments and cease all settlement activities in the OPTs. Approving further settlement serves only to raise tensions in the West Bank. Both Israel and the Palestinian Authority should demonstrate through their policies a genuine commitment to the two-state solution. It is vital that we all work together to deliver peace, dignity, and security for Israelis and Palestinians alike. And in this respect, I very much welcome Dr. Muasha's thoughtful briefing earlier. Third, President, on the wider risk in the region. We are acutely aware of the conflict's potential to spill over to the wider region. We are engaging at the most senior levels to caution against further escalation along the blue line. A full-blown conflict between Israel and Hezbollah would be catastrophic for Lebanon and the region. We also condemn illegal and unjustified attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea by Houthi militants. These attacks are harming the global economy, threatening regional security, and risking innocent lives. In conclusion, President, in Resolution 2720, we underscored the need for conditions that would allow for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. These include the immediate and unconditional release of hostages held by Hamas and an end to the threat posed to Israel by rocket attacks and other forms of terrorism. Sustainable peace and security for both the Israeli and Palestinian people requires that we then redouble our efforts to deliver a new political horizon toward the delivery of two states, a secure and stable Israel with a viable and independent Palestine, living side by side in peace and security. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of the UK for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting, and I thank all the speakers for the presentations. As this Council meets for the last time in its current composition, the need for a lasting political solution to put an end to the hostilities, ensure the protection of the civilian population, and free the hostages is imperative in the Middle East. We have a collective responsibility to make this a reality in the new year, a year that will begin in the cold, in the damp, and under the rubble for far too many children, their parents, and their loved ones. In this context, reports on the latest developments in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, as well as on the northern border with Lebanon, continue to be of great concern to us. Figures verified by the UN make 2023 the deadliest year in almost 20 years, both in Israel and Gaza, but also in the West Bank. This dismal record does not spare children, according to UNICEF. The increased intensity of violent acts committed by settlers, which Switzerland condemns, have led to the forced displacement of pastoralist communities and have the potential to lead to even more violence. While recalling the settlements are illegal under international law, Switzerland stresses that Israel is responsible for maintaining order in the West Bank and calls on it to hold the perpetrators of these acts accountable. In the context of operations by Israeli security forces in the West Bank, the use of force must in particular meet the criterion of proportionality and respect the rights of every individual to life and security. We will continue to emphasize that respect for international humanitarian law and human rights, particularly with regard to the protection of civilians, must remain a priority for this Council. Switzerland recalls the obligations of all parties under international law, including the obligation to protect the civilian population. As we have done since October 7th, Switzerland condemns the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas. In particular, we condemn the sexual and gender-based violence of which many women and girls have been victims in the context of these attacks. We call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages still being held in Gaza. Switzerland recognizes Israel's right to ensure its own security. At the same time, we have not ceased to call on the parties to protect civilians and to respect international humanitarian law. It is vital that all violations of international law committed in Israel and throughout the occupied Palestinian territory are investigated and perpetrators brought to justice. The situation in the Gaza Strip is catastrophic. The humanitarian situation. Populations deprived of access to medical services, health infrastructure, hygiene, and drinking water. 90% of populations in a situation of acute food insecurity. Humanitarian aid must be delivered unhindered, and we welcome the appointment. We are the informal focal point for this conflict, and we believe that humanitarian aid must be delivered unhindered and without preconditions to civilians in need throughout the Gaza Strip. We welcome the appointment of Ms. Sigrid Kaag as Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, and we call for the full implementation of Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720. Despite the adoption of these resolutions, the aid delivered remains insufficient. A humanitarian truce and security guarantees are urgent prerequisites for guaranteeing access to aid and enabling the staff of impartial humanitarian organizations to work effectively without risking their lives. Mr. President, without putting an end to the current spiral of violence, the risk of a regionalization of the conflict remains real and will compromise a lasting political solution to the conflict in the Middle East. This Council must take concrete steps towards a two-state solution, which is the only possible basis for peace and stability in the region. In this process, the full, equal, and unique participation of Palestinian and Israeli women is essential. We must help to rebuild the basis for two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me join others in thanking all the briefers for their presentations. We will never be out of words to express our utter condemnation of the carefully planned and brutally executed terrorist attacks of 7 October, which, let's not forget, triggered this acute crisis. We can't express enough our firm rejection of taking civilians hostage, keeping them in horrible conditions when the entire world, including the Security Council, have repeatedly called for their immediate and unconditional release. We are horrified by the emerging hideous stories of sexual violence used by Hamas as a weapon of terror on Israeli civilians, women and girls. And it is unfortunate and incomprehensible that nearly 3 months after the unthinkable was savagely unleashed upon civilians in Israel, the Security Council has not been able to issue a condemnation of these terror acts. Mr. President, Albania shares the international community's deep concerns on the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. The relentless bombardments have claimed far too many innocent lives. The widespread destruction has made life impossible for many and extremely difficult for all in Gaza. Innocent civilians are punished twice by the cowardice of Hamas, but also the heavy-handed response of Israel. We reiterate our call for full compliance with international humanitarian law and to exercise the principles of proportionality and distinction. Terrorists must be killed, but not the innocent civilians, UN workers or journalists who must be protected. We welcome the appointment of the Senior Humanitarian Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza as called for in Resolution 2720. The full and speedy implementation of Resolution 2712 and 2720 must be seen as a matter of absolute priority by everyone. Mr. President, the situation in the West Bank has further deteriorated since Hamas' attack in Israel. Increased army raids and acts of violence by Israeli settlers against Palestinians are taking a mounting toll. More than 400 Palestinians have been killed so far in the West Bank, far more than last year, the year declared as the deadliest since 2006. Our position remains that settlements and their expansion are illegal under international law and an impediment to peace process. They must be disbanded, not expanded. Mr. President, the risk of spillover of the conflict is real. Everywhere around Israel, there is one actor, one country, one hand that continues to pull the strings through its proxies, and this is Iran. Ignoring it is not a contribution to peace. In this respect, the continued attacks by the Houthis in the Red Sea, denying navigational rights and freedoms of all vessels, pose a grave threat to international peace and security. We call on the Houthis to immediately cease these attacks and for the Security Council to take appropriate action. Colleagues, the ongoing war in Gaza obscures everything, including prospects of how to get out of it and move ahead and revive the stalled peace process in the Middle East, which cannot continue to remain the historic unfinished business. As soon as the Gaza war will be over, work should start anew, seeking a lasting and comprehensive solution. This has never been easy, and it will not be easier now, because it will require serious, sustained, and credible efforts to ensure that terror and violence are no longer used to achieve political goals, and they are definitely and resolutely rejected by all. It will need Gaza and West Bank united under a single, renewed Palestinian Authority, fully committed to and ready to peace through negotiations with the help of the international community. It will require sustained and massive efforts of assistance for those internally displaced to return to normal life and a colossal reconstruction effort to make Gaza again a living place. But it will require, more than anything, a shared understanding that equality between Israelis and Palestinians is the glue for charting their shared destiny together. There has never been any alternative, and there is no other credible and serious path to the future than the two-state solution if we want a solution: peace, security, and lasting stability. Only a genuine process that leads to an independent, sovereign, and democratic Palestinian state alongside Israel will be able to guarantee security, stability, and prosperity for the Palestinian and Israeli people alike. This is what we have been saying and defending always, especially during these 2 years in the Security Council, and will continue to do so from outside the Council. Because we remain profoundly convinced that both Palestinians and Israelis who share that tiny land have a right to statehood there and are bound by a shared destiny. May this tragedy make wisdom prevail, with lessons learned through successive failures and missed opportunities, and make everyone understand and accept that violence will never bring peace. It will only breed more of the same: violence, pain, suffering, regrets, and misery, when everyone there needs and deserves the contrary: hope, peace, and stability. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President, Mozambique thanks the United Arab Emirates for calling this urgent meeting to address the dire humanitarian situation currently unfolding in Gaza. We are grateful to the briefers for their valuable insights and assessments. Their first-hand accounts reinforce the critical need for immediate Council action on this matter. The military offensive in Gaza has brought in intense suffering with exponentially increased casualties. The indiscriminate attacks by the IDF demonstrate blatant disregard for human rights and international law. As a matter of fact, no one is safe in Gaza. Mozambique has repeatedly voiced her grave concerns over the exacerbating tensions, including settlements, violence against civilians, provocative rhetoric, and clashes between both parties. Mr. President, all these unlawful and vile activities in flagrant violation under the international law and UN Charter must cease immediately. Furthermore, we are deeply troubled by the fact that this conflict could spread throughout the region. We call on all protagonists to exercise maximum restraint and work towards de-escalation. The international community must continue to advocate for a just and peaceful resolution to this long-standing conflict. An immediate action is imperative to prevent further human tragedy. Indeed, it is now becoming an existential threat to life itself. An immediate ceasefire is imperative to enable vital humanitarian access and protect innocent lives. All parties must respect their legal obligation to safeguard civilians and ensure that life-saving assistance reaches the affected innocent civilian in Gaza. Mr. President, precisely a week ago, this Council adopted the second resolution on scaling up and monitoring aid to Gaza. Both the newly adopted Resolution 2720 and the previous Resolution 2712 called for the urgent and extended humanitarian pauses and corridors in Gaza to allow the safe and unhindered access for UN agencies and partners. We urge warring parties to urgently implement these measures given the morally untenable humanitarian emergency. Lives are at risk. Therefore, we have an obligation to act expeditiously to protect and save the vulnerable population of Gaza, especially women and children, through the delivery of life-saving assistance. We reiterate our firm support for the mediation effort by Egypt and other actors to halt the bloodshed in the Gaza Strip. Mr. President, we remain convinced that the only alternative for peace in the Gaza Strip is the immediate cessation of violence and the resumption of constructive dialogue. We believe in and strongly support the two-state solution as a pathway to a lasting peace between Palestine and Israel and harmony in the region. We believe that the existing Security Council and General Assembly resolutions provide a just framework towards achieving this noble goal. Mr. President, to conclude, we cannot stand idle while the lives of innocent civilians are at risk. We must act with courage and moral clarity to alleviate the suffering and revitalize the peace process. The cost of inaction is too grave. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of Ecuador. First of all, I would like to thank the briefers this morning for all of the information they provided to the Council. Just more than a week ago, the Special Coordinator for the Middle East peace process, Tor Wennesland, addressed the Council and said that although it is understandable that one wishes to prioritize the situation in Gaza, we should not overlook the fact that over the first 9 months of the year, we were focusing on the West Bank in crisis, with incessant settlement activities, an increase in violence by settlers and Palestinian armed attacks, the intensification of operations by Israeli security forces, and a very difficult economic backdrop as well. Ecuador unequivocally condemns the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October, and we once again demand the immediate unconditional release of all the hostages. Since those terrorist attacks, the magnitude of the violence in Gaza has meant that events in other localities have slipped away from the spotlight. Nevertheless, the negative trends since the beginning of October in the West Bank have also increased. The levels of violence have grown, and with them, the statistics of deaths and detentions. All of those responsible for violent acts must be brought to justice, and the security forces must always use restraint. And we condemn all terrorist acts and all terrorist attacks. Your Excellencies, colleagues, as was stated in the President's statement adopted last February, we strongly oppose all unilateral measures that make peace more difficult, such as the construction and expansion of settlements, the confiscation of land from the Palestinians, and the demolition of Palestinian houses and civilians' displacement. These activities jeopardize the viability of the two-state solution, which Ecuador, like all members of the Council here present, has expressed support for. In addition, we believe that the increase in incendiary rhetoric, provocation, incitement, and the unacceptable glorification of the assassination of civilians and terrorist attacks moves us further away from the possibility of a negotiated solution. As I already said on the 19th of December, all leaders need to show responsibility and humanity. Colleagues, Your Excellencies, we know that the path towards lasting peace will be difficult. We need to take this path as soon as possible. We have taken some steps, but we need to move further towards implementation. That is why we once again reiterate our belief that the only way to put an end to this conflict is through a peaceful, negotiated, fair and lasting solution for the parties, with the existence of two states, Palestine and Israel, on the basis of the 1967 borders and in line with the relevant resolutions. I now resume my function as President of the Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.